Hello and welcome to the Heads and Volleys podcast with me, Lee Dunn. Really appreciate you joining me today. I am going to lead us on a little pathway along a recent assignment I've been working on with regards to leading your player, and specifically how we can begin to create individual development plans and what that means to the player, what that means to you, to your team, and to the general culture around you, and how it's really going to benefit everybody involved, and effectively why we don't do it and why I'm arguing now that we really should be doing it. And if you're not offering this, then maybe it's something you begin to consider to offer. Or if you've lost players, or if you've lost teams that have left somewhere else because of aspects like this being offered, then you may begin to understand why. So I'll follow along a pathway of why and why not, why and why would we not use an individual development plan. I will incorporate some of the game model episode that we just released with Paddy King and how that begins to influence an individual development plan. I will share with you my approach, kind of the pathway I follow and the cycle that I take. And then importantly, that will include the player. All too often, this may be a coach's way of saying, I would like you to play in this certain way, and so here are all the goals for you. But your player is so important because they give you so much buy-in, or they don't buy in, and all of your work that you'll put into this will kind of fall flat on its face. So that's a pathway we'll follow along. But before I get into that, thanks as always to Tactical Pad for their support and sponsorship in terms of leading the player here and applying it to the gifts that you can create with Tactical Pad. Showing your players what you expect of them in moments of a practice or in moments of a game can only help them understand. Everybody learns in different ways, and I'm sure you've heard it all before, that most people can be told what to do and they'll perform fine. But there are also visual learners, and Tactical Pad really provides that material. So head on over to Lee Dunn Soccer and take a look for the discount code to join up with Tactical Pad. Start making a difference in your practices. So let's start with why not. Why would you not do an individual development plan? Typically, the answers will revolve around the fact that it is a coach issue. Because if you ask anybody why they coach, generally the answer will be that they're involved because of their love of the game and they really want the kids to develop and to develop a passion for the game. You ask me, for me it's very similar. I love what I do because A, I love the game. The game has given me so many opportunities and enhanced my life in so many ways. I want everybody to experience the same thing. So if I can offer something additional to push these players and to engage with them on a different level, then an individual development plan is really something that I can commit my time to. Why not? Well, it takes a lot of time. I have to really connect with my players. I have to get to know them in new ways. I have to have a clear pathway set out for the individual, for the team, for the season, for the year, maybe for the club if I'm in a position of power. So that's a lot of work that would contribute to the why not. Primarily time. Apparently everybody is running out of time. Nobody has enough time in a day. But if you really apply yourself, you're applying yourself by listening to this, at the end of this episode, you spend the same amount of time from this episode as you do putting together a pathway and a template, then you work on it with players and it begins to fill itself out. So the why not, I think, is a real short discussion into you reframing the benefit that you are offering to your players. Most of us are probably paid. Now, how do we justify that pay? We justify it on the field, but you are more than just a coach on the field. You have so much chance of influence and so much impact on families that you can have this continuing document that a player can take with them, or within your club, you can begin to influence the environment so that everybody is doing the same thing. Or you may already do this and just think, Lee, this is great. I already do this and I reap the benefits. You think about creating a culture around you where people look at you and say, I want to play for that coach. Now, if you're creating these players that really want to be involved and are really challenging themselves because of what they deem valuable, because you've listened to them and it's written in their own development plan and you keep them accountable, now you're going to attract those types of players. If you don't care, and I'm not judging either way, But if you don't care and you don't really want to go ahead with creating something like an individual plan, then you are going to attract players who will have a very similar mentality. You'll have parents who will have a similar mentality. If you tell a parent that your players is going to play and they'll play twice a week or 3 times a week and they'll play in a game at the weekends and that'll be it, then you will get that same commitment from them. If you outline, this is what I expect from you and from your player, because you as a parent is keeping your player accountable, now you've got a different level of engagement with that family and you're going to get a different result from that player throughout the season. I mentioned the tie-in with the game model episode. For me, I think a game model is so valuable because you have to know what you are trying to achieve. Then you can begin to identify how that player fits within your system, within your game model, but then also what their skills and weaknesses are in the general picture too. So the game of soccer is the game of soccer. You win by scoring more goals than the opponent. Now the creativity comes into it because you can identify how you would like to win that game or how you would like to be competitive in that game. Of course, the hot topic for the last few years has been to play out of the back. Then whether you're looking to play into the wingers because you play in a 4-3-3 and you really like a high and wide 7 and 11, or I like to play into a number 9 and use a number 9 as a focal point, so I like to penetrate centrally. Now I can say to my striker in his individual development plan, it's really important that you have these skills identified by the game model because the ball is going to come into your feet and you're often going to be under pressure. So I know what I'm asking of him. Now he is also able to say, I think I'm good at it, I'm not so good at it, and I need to work on it. I can identify players that he can watch and begin to simulate. But he has an understanding of what is being asked of him. Remember my comment about Greg Berhalter saying that he has these players that are phenomenal athletes and professional soccer players, and they still like to be told what to do specifically too. So now let's take that down a level to a player who's just playing recreationally or competitively, but it's definitely not all of his life. Now we're still looking and considering how we can impact that player, and part of that is by knowing exactly what I want and what I want him to be able to do. And I think it's really key to identify your style of play within that game model. And of course, I think your game model will tend to your style of play anyway, with things such as possession or certain ways of playing. Like you'll always switch from one side to the other real quick because the way you set your game model up is you are packing one side of the field with short passes with the look to release to switch. So now you incorporate a style of play that's expansive. But then knowing what you're looking for, you can then drill down into your own philosophy and your way of delivering that. So you say, I would like to use, for example, lots of small-sided games. So if I'm going to use lots of small-sided games in my practices, there is an argument and a podcast coming soon on the argument of technique training versus individual skill and developing that in a practice. So effectively saying opposed versus unopposed practices. So then if I identify as an individual that I like my practices to look like a game, I don't think that within the hour and 15, the hour and 30 of the session, I can really hone in on individual isolated skill. Now, there are many camps that will argue that you don't need to do that, and there are camps that will argue you can. But in this situation, I've identified that for the majority of my practices, I want it to look like a game. So now within the individual development plan for my player, I can identify you need to work on these skills. Here, for example, is a skill set that I want you to practice this week or this development period that we're working through this individual development plan. And I may give them a plan every month or review the plan every month. And then just like as if you go to the gym, your workouts and your exercises will improve. They will become more complex. They'll become more intense. And the same thing for my players. If I identify I want to work mostly in small-sided games and perhaps philosophically I don't agree with isolated skill practice, then I can identify with the player that you are required to go and work on your skills. And here is how you can do it. You can play at school, you play with your friends, you can take on some of these apps that are out there where you can be challenged on a global leaderboard for the amount of touches you do on the ball or the amount of juggles or anything like that. But it begins with me identifying what my practices will look like. Again, personally, I prefer the game model approach of it looking like the game so we can replicate those game moments. So now my players need to go and work more technically and isolated with the ball at their feet. That's something I can incorporate in my individual development plan. Is it wrong? Is it right? We can have a discussion all day about that on Twitter, but that's the way I am taking my team. So now let's consider the individual that you are creating the plan for. If you will ask most of your players, and hopefully you have, why do you play soccer? Most of them will say because they want to be professionals. And that, to be honest, is great, because when I first came to the US 10 years ago and I was running summer camps in the middle of Northern California, and I'd sit with a kid over lunch and say, why do you play soccer? And unfortunately, the majority of the answer was, I'm here because it's soccer camp week, and next week I'm at basketball camp, and the week after I'm doing outdoor camp, or whatever the theme of the week was. But now we have so many more players playing because they actually love the game and they really genuinely want to go far in the game, I believe, but I don't think they understand what that means to go far. So part one of having an individual development plan is you can paint a picture for a player and identify what is required of them to become almost professional, or to take the steps towards a professional level. Because the first thing I ask a player is, why do you play soccer? What is your ultimate goal? Your ultimate goal, of course, is to play for the US national team, or for here in the Bay Area, we look at the San Jose Earthquakes or even the LA Galaxy, or they want to go to Stanford and play. Brilliant. But how are you going to get there? And that is where this development plan can really drill down to a micro level of saying, what does it take for you to go from, for example, U13 to U14? And are you in the correct environment to be playing at the right level for U14 to then go and play the right level at U15? So now you're beginning to identify not only your pathway and your skill level, but the environment that you're finding yourself in. And I think, to go back to the why not, a lot of coaches may be scared of losing players, or may be scared of almost outing themselves, because the players and the families that are clever can look at it and say, well, if we really do want to go to Stanford, then this is not the right environment for us, because we're not playing at the right level, or we're not surrounded by the right type of player or the type of mentality that my player needs to take them on to the next level. Maybe it's because they're playing at the lowest level, or maybe just the environment is not the best place with the commitment level of players, for example. And it's also super interesting to have a conversation with a player and find out why they play, what do they love about the game, what don't they like about the game, what do they like about your practices versus another coach that has had practices with them, or their school team, or they're playing just because their friends are playing, or it's a status because your club is quite a significant club in the area, so your parents really like that this kid plays for this team because they can put the sticker on their car and they can wear the sweater on the weekend. Whatever the deal is, now you're asking questions of a player that you would never have known otherwise. And I bring this up because I recently coached players at U14 and asking their same question: what's your long-term goal, short-term goal, where do you want to end up, where do you want to play? And one of the players who I thought had a brilliant ability within the team, but just never really seemed to apply himself all that much. And so when I had this conversation with him, I asked, where do you want to go? And he said, well, it doesn't matter anyway, because I'm going to have to go to Europe and go to college in Europe because that's what my family want me to do. So from sitting on the side of the fence and thinking, this kid just doesn't care, what's his deal? And I'm sure everyone can relate to that. What's this kid's problem? He's got so much ability. Oh, if I had that ability, I'd be a pro, or whatever we think about when we see that. But this poor kid feels like his pathway has already been created for him because his parents have said, you're going to go to Europe and go to school. So now he thinks that it's not really worth trying all that much. So now I have some more material to be able to, A, shape his development plan and shape his goals. But then that's also a conversation I can have with him and with his family, and even when considering where he wants to go to school at high school level, because that's going to help him in the long run. If he really wants to be a soccer player, that's a conversation that we now have some material to have a conversation with his family about and identify this kid has some real good ability. But I would never have known that had I not had that conversation with him and had I not considered an individual development plan. He would have just been that kid who was typically, he had some ability, but he just didn't care. He just didn't want it enough. And unfortunately, I think a lot of kids will fall by that wayside. And we're really, truly doing them a disservice if we are not giving them every opportunity to voice who they are and to share what they want to do. Then I don't think that we're really fulfilling our role as a coach. Now, of course, you're also going to get those players who will say, I just play because I like it and I don't really care about playing in college. And for some coaches, that may be a hard pill to swallow because they want everybody to take the game as seriously as they do. But ultimately, the benefit of this individual player plan is that you're creating this environment for this player to be successful. You can now shape their plan on not necessarily about winning and losing or getting into a college environment, but it's about their own individual development. Of course, we are working on and creating players that are also going to become adults, and they're going to become adults in a real world. They're not just going to be soccer players. You look at the stats of players that are actually going to make it to the top level, and I think they're slightly skewed because of the amount of players that are playing. So of course there is only a real finite amount of players that can make it to the pro level anyway. But you think about your regular team that you're working with, maybe one or two may go on to a good college career, or maybe 3 or 4. So there is a good chance that a lot of these players you are creating lifelong lovers of the game. People that really love to play and people that have such a positive experience that when they have kids, they may become coaches and they may pass on the good vibes that you were giving as a coach. It's not only about creating these fantastic players that can go on to the next level. It's also about this holistic approach to this individual that is going to become an adult in society. So what does that individual development plan look like? Is it a workable document? Is it something you print? Is it a template that you sit down with the player and begin to fill in? This is for you to decide, because you've got to decide what's going to be super valuable to you and valuable to your player. So I love to include just basic information, things like their height and weight. You can add them, you can not add them, you can add their birthday. You can just begin to accumulate specific information that you think is going to be relative to you. You think about including things like their date of birth and their height and weight. You can begin to work on things like biobanding, or you can begin to at least identify how they're growing in relation to everybody else in the team. And whilst that may seem fairly obvious when you stand them all shoulder to shoulder on the field, you can actually keep track of who this individual is and actually pay attention to what they're growing like. If they suddenly now, and when you do a check-in, and I'll talk about kind of time frames, but suddenly they've gained 20 pounds or suddenly they've gained 4 inches of height, now you're aware that something is going on within that player, that now you might find it's Mr. Tickle running down the field and he's all arms and legs and he doesn't quite have control because he hasn't grown into his body yet. So simple things like that that just encourage you to be more aware of who your players are. So then consider what the training plan is. Why are you doing it? It really helps to identify specific objectives and then the purpose. And of course, as with anything, to have goals that are measurable. We're going to try and set deadlines. You think about setting your own personal goals. You set timelines on when you would like to achieve them by. Now, it doesn't mean that I want to be a pro is on there and then in 20 years, maybe we'll reflect on this and see if I made it. But again, back to the kind of the baby steps of saying, I want to be a successful U14 player from a U13 player. Well, that gives us 1 year to get to this point to reflect. And then I begin to identify what that looks like moving backwards. So you may create something like a schedule or something like almost like a skill challenge. For me, it's all about small small-sided games and game situations. So I'm going to influence the player by saying, I want you to work on passing back and forth off a wall, for example, a skill wall or a garage wall, whatever it is. And I want you to do that for 20 minutes a day, and I want you to work on alternate feet, and I want you to do that 3 times a week. Now I can have the player, a box in there for the player when I review with them to say, how was it? Did you do it? Did you do it every day? I could even go further and say, keep a diary, send me a video, apply all those videos, count touches, try and beat yesterday's touch count. Whatever it is, now I'm keeping this player accountable. Then I may look at, and this is what I do, I incorporate some short-term goals and then to some long-term goals. And the way I like to do it is I say to the player, what are your short-term goals for this season or for this year or for next year? Then what are your long-term goals? And there are no right or wrong answers. If the kid says I want to be a US national team player, I'm going to write it down. And I'm going to write down how it comes out of their mouth. So they may say I want to be a men's national team player, and then I want to play in high school, and then I want to play at college. Well, then I'm going to say, great, that's brilliant. Why? Who am I to say that your dreams are wrong or right or that they're silly? Like, it's a safe space. That's what you want to do? Brilliant. Now I'm going to work with you on reorganizing those long-term goals to something that, or into a way that it's achievable. So US national team is probably not achievable before you go to high school. So let's get high school top of the list. High school is number one focus. Then from high school, we may look at college and then into US national team. So those goals are still relevant, but I'm just going to assist you in making heads and tails of them and saying this one is going to come first. So let's plan for that one first. That will then work into the short-term goals. So you want to go to high school. We've got 2 or 3 years before you go. Now we begin to identify what that looks like. And of course, does he want to be a U14 national team player? Probably. But a high school player or a successful club player is going to come first. So again, we begin to identify his little pathway within those short-term goals to get to that bigger goal along the way. I may incorporate things like my game model. So I would like you as the number 9 to be strong, to shield the ball, to have a good first touch. So now within the 4 pillars of the game, if I go that way, I will use the technical and identify the technical requirements of a player in that position. You need to be able to have a good touch. You need to use both parts of your feet. You need to be able to turn quickly. You need to be able to shield the ball. Now that will fill in my technical, tactical, my psychosocial, and then also my physical aspects. And it's all relative to his position, and then it's also relative to where he wants to go. So he identifies that he loves to play striker and he appreciates the role that is being asked of him. Okay, so now you are going to tell me, and I'm going to tell you, or I'm going to work with you on what it looks like for you to be better technically in that position. How do you think you're going to be better in that position? Okay, so you think you're going to control 9 out of 10 balls that are fired into you. Well, I know from watching the game, it's kind of difficult. So we're actually going to say, you are going to create space to receive the ball so you can break that pressure a little easier. So now one of my tactical goals for you is to watch these players on TV, on YouTube, whatever, and watch how they create space. Then you're going to practice that in your little skill practices that I'm going to assign you. And then we're going to judge how many times, not only do you control the ball, but how many times do you receive the ball with a yard of space around you? Because that becomes an easier time to control the ball. These are measurable goals, and we can say at the end of every game, because I'm going to involve his parents, and I'm going to say, I want you to count how many times he does it. I don't want you to talk about it with him. I just want you to count, and I want you to send it to me. Because then I can say in my checkup with him, look, we've had 5 games and look at these numbers, whether you've improved, whether you've not, whether it's difficult, whatever, but that's part of the review process. But I have that data to keep him accountable. So then I'm going to include things like nutrition. And I may just start simple, and I think we can all agree that a fast food dinner the night before or 2 nights before a game is not ideal, or on the morning of a game. So I'm going to say that. I encourage you to have a good hearty breakfast before a game. The night before a game, I encourage you to have a strong hearty meal that is not fast food. He's a kid. He can't determine when his parents say, we're just going to go out for dinner and we're going to go and grab fast food. But he can have an opinion, and his parents are going to be aware of his development plan and his opinion that may just begin to change their approach too. Is it likely? We'll see about that. I remember being told off by a parent for asking a kid why he was eating cheese out of a can, because I didn't think that was very good for him. But of course, I can't tell a kid what is and what is not good for them. But part of my conversation with this kid is going to be educating them and asking the question, is a fast food meal good for you, or is it better to get a good bit of protein and some carbs in on the night before a game? And any clever kid will identify that that is probably the best way, yet probably not as nice as a Big Mac, but they'll take it knowing that this is part of their development plan. So then I'll follow my own little process for this. And my process in leading this player, it kind of follows a flow chart, and I will be sharing this in the show notes, that I have my style of play, my philosophy, my goals and the player's goals that will feed into what is now the player development plan. It's a tangible document that the player and I and the family and the club can review at any time. Anybody can pull it up. So then I follow a 3-step process from that development plan, and I have the delivery. I keep myself accountable to challenging this player to be playing in an environment that is going to allow them to develop. It's going to allow them to work on the action items within their development plan. They and myself are going to be learning, is this quite working? And it's a constant reflection process. Is the player being challenged? Is the player receiving enough touches on the ball or enough repetition to be working in this environment and working on their development plan? If I really want them to focus on checking into spaces, how many times in a practice do they get it? Now, of course, there are different practices where that may not always be the case, but if I say to myself, okay, I'm going to commit to you once or twice a week in a practice that you are going to get ample opportunity to be performing that way, now I can review my own practices and identify whether I'm actually delivering on that or not. And then the review process, and this is something that I touched on really quick, but how often do you review with the player? Do you have enough time in a week or in a month to sit down with every player to then talk about it with them? Can you text your players? Now, if you text your players, does that have the same meaning to them as it does when you actually sit down and take 10, 15, 20 minutes with them? Do you have the space to be able to do that? Or do you only see your players at practice, and right after practice, they're taking off to another practice, or they've got to go home, and you lose any chance to have that conversation with them? And even if you did one player before practice and one player after practice, if you've got an 18-man roster, that's 9 practices. So that could be 3 weeks in the time it takes to actually review with with every player. So now, how feasible is it to do a review every month? And it may be something that you set up every season. So for example, here in Northern California, we have a spring season and a fall season. So we could set goals for the entire year, and then an even smaller goal will be a season goal. Then the season goal will be reviewed at the end of it, and then how does that fit in within the larger goal of the year, and then how does that fit in within the long-term goal of, for example, becoming a national team player. Now that allows me to focus on that player consistently every season. They know that this is coming. Instead of me saying, yeah, I'm going to meet you every month or every week, and that just gets pushed back, or you don't quite have enough time. So think about in your environment, and a lot of clubs will tout that they are providing a great value for your players because you're providing some form of a written evaluation at the end of every season. Well, what's better, a written evaluation that tells the player what they're doing well and what they're not doing so well, or a tangible document that is continuing to evolve as the seasons move on? I think this document that continues to evolve is so valuable because A, the player now feels like they're even more committed to you and to the process because they have this pathway that they're following along. So you've got less chance of losing these players. But then you've also got this document that has this buy-in from the family too, because I've written evaluations for players and the response I get from the parents is completely agree. So why did I just spend half an hour writing these heartfelt feelings about this player's technical ability and about their tactical ability when the parents will reply and say, yeah, we see that as well. Of course, most parents sit and watch the games. They see the same things that you're explaining. But what we're not really giving them is any kind of pathway or process for them to develop. Now, if we're truly the professionals that we want to be, surely an individual development plan will go along the way of encouraging that player to take the next step in their career as a soccer player. Not just an evaluation that says, great job, I thought you did well at this, you could improve on this, but let's actually identify those things before and now see how they've improved throughout. So there is nothing better than knowing as much as possible about an individual. When they are arriving at practice, you have something to discuss with them. Instead of the typical conversation that is generally one way, how was school today? How was your weekend? How was this? How was that? And the typical answer is good, not much, yeah. Now I can say, how many practices did you do last week on the wall? Okay, great. That's really good to know. Or did you beat your score? Because I know what your scores are and I know what your individual challenge is. So I'm keeping this player accountable. And if you have this personal connection with a player, then they instantly feel like they don't want to let you down. You think about the people that you've worked for, the people that have encouraged you and empowered you are typically the people that you've never really wanted to let down and will do anything for. Even though it's improving you, you feel like you're also doing them a service by performing yourself. Now think about the people that constantly ride you. I think about when someone asks you to do something over and over and over and over again, you're less and less and less likely to do that thing. So when I'm encouraging my players to work on those skills, I want to know, did you beat your score? Come on, man. Or next time they take a brilliant touch, it's a comment of saying, hey, that skill practice is really paying off because I know what I've asked you to do and I know what you are now doing outside of practice or what you are not doing, because then the conversation can also be, I think that with more touches on the ball from the wall, for example, how is that going? Is it hard? Is it too easy? Because I think with if we can refine this, that next time you get the ball like that, it's going to be perfect. Now it's a combined process with this individual and they are working with me on achieving instead of just being told, go and practice. Did you practice? Did you practice? Did you practice? Because the same thing's going to happen. They're going to end up just resenting whatever this development plan looks like, and they're not going to really benefit from it. You are not going to benefit because you're not going to do it. You're going to dread following up with the players because now it just becomes something that you're forcing on the individual as opposed to something that they can really truly benefit from. So I'm going to share on leadunsoccer.com, I'll share a little template of what an individual development plan looks like, and I'll share my flowchart of working too. And it's really simple, and it's a simple process from the 1,000-foot level. The true value in it is the execution. You coach 2 or 3 teams, it's a difficult process. It takes a lot of time, but the bond and connection that you build with your players not only encourages them, it encourages their family. It encourages a culture. It develops a culture around you where people want to buy into that because they know when they join your team, this is the expectation. Back to the original starting conversation that said, why not? Well, it's so much easier to not do it. And I completely agree when you consider the amount of time you have to spend in this environment. But if this is your job, this is your career, this is something that you're working on becoming better and better at, then this is a no-brainer in my opinion. And you begin to identify yourself as the next level of coach that the players are looking for. You consider the pathway, and US Soccer want to have 300,000 licensed soccer coaches in the US, soon you're going to have to differentiate yourself in another way. Everybody's going to have an A license, or a lot of people are going to have an A license. What makes you a different A license coach to Coach John on the other side of the room, who's also applying for the same position or also applying for the same coaching position as you? This is one of those things that I strongly believe in starting, just like your game model, and this feeds off of your game model. So go back to last week's episode with Paddy and consider what your basic game model looks like, and then how that begins to influence the players in your environment. Another solid thank you to Tactical Pad. Definitely check them out. I'll constantly post things on my Twitter and on my Instagram too, @LeadOnSoccer. So check it out. I would love to have your feedback. So share this, comment, tweet me, let me know what you're thinking. Let me know if it's something you do. I recently put something on Twitter, and now people are sharing game model templates, and people are using this as the tool that it was meant to be. It's meant to be an environment that's creating questions and comments, and it's challenging thoughts and processes of individuals that are just going to get a little bit better. So if you have something to contribute, let me know @LeadOnSoccer. There's more coming as always from Heads and Volleys. Thanks for listening, and I'll speak to you soon.